No Pokemon game is 100% perfect, and some of these are farther perfect than others. But what's actually the biggest issue in every mainline game? Well, I tried to get an answer in my personal opinion, so let's start with Generation 1 with Red, Blue, and Yellow. Despite being the introduction into the biggest media franchise of all time, this was obviously the most broken game on the list. While it's funny to poke fun at the ugly sprites in the original versions, the real issues had to do with the battle system. There were many issues with specific moves, items, and typing, so I won't bother mentioning them all, but here's a few. Hyper Beam didn't need to recharge if it knocked out a Pokemon, which was a super common occurrence considering Hyper Beam had one of the highest base power stats in the game. Psychic types were immune to Ghost types instead of being weak to them. Not only that, but Ghost types were considered physical attacks, not even though Ghost types had high special stats. Every available Ghost type was also dual typed with Poison, which, guess what, made them weak to Psychic type moves anyway. And if all that wasn't enough, the only Ghost type moves that could deal damage were Lick and Nightshade. Two moves. Talk about making a type just completely useless here. The freeze status effect was basically permanent unless you had a curing item for it, instead of the typical 20% chance to thaw every turn. 100% accuracy moves could still miss. Focus Energy and Dire Hit reduced your critical hit chance. Like the item is called the Dire Hit, it's supposed to help you. I don't know what Game Freak was doing over here, and Wrap, Bind, and Fire Spin could completely lock enemies out of doing anything at all. I'm sure you can tell by now how fundamentally broken everything in this battle system was. For Gold, Silver, and Crystal, these games are often remembered as a step forward for Pokemon, fixing a lot of the previous technical issues in Gen 1. However, what was fixed in the battle system was ruined a little bit in other ways. While I originally felt like Gen 2 struggled with the selection of new Pokemon, I think the bigger issue is making your team suitable for the late game. Gen 2 isn't particularly hard for the majority of the adventure. In fact, I'd actually say too easy. See, in Gen 2, Game Freak wanted to give the player the option to play the game a little more freely in the middle portion of the gyms. Basically, you reach a crossroads and get to choose the order in which you beat certain gym leaders. This was great for replayability, but in terms of balancing, it was terrible. What ended up happening was these gym leaders caused extremely unbalanced leveling for the trainers leading up to them. Of course, Game Freak wanted to make sure that you could complete these in any order, but what ended up happening is that the linear scaling of levels was interrupted to make this possible. Later on, when you reach the 8th gym leader, there's a massive jump in levels, and while this later part of the game does eventually try to balance things out, the damage is already done at this point. I specifically remember getting absolutely walled by Claire, throwing my team at her over and over until I gave up and just was going up against Dragonair for what felt like an entire afternoon. Your Pokemon are not properly leveled by the time you reach the hardest part of the game, the Elite Four and the Champion. And yes, the grinding is part of any RPG, right? Except in this game, almost all of the grinding is loaded into the final stretch before the Elite Four. Honestly, most of the grinding probably is the Elite Four because the Victory Road trainers aren't even that strong themselves. You have barely any experience points to distribute across your team if you're running 6 Pokemon. And while we could talk about Kanto and the issues with that part of the game, I think the fact that the main region of the game, Johto, doesn't even have proper level scaling is the worst part. This is the main storyline, and it gets interrupted by hours of unnecessary grinding depending on your team, and I think that's the worst part of Gen 2. Before I get to the next games, these videos take a lot of time to make, so if you're enjoying so far, would really appreciate it if you subscribe. Gen 3 is the generation where I feel like Pokemon really elevated its game visually and technically. This is the point where the games become more appealing in terms of the new graphical style on the GBA, and even in the battle system there was a ton of new features. There was double battling, which eventually became the new main format of battling in Pokemon competitively, but the thing I actually want to focus on isn't battling, graphics, music, or even region design. It's just the fact that there's so many HMs required in this game. Hoenn is one of those beautiful regions in Pokemon, and some would even argue the most beautiful, and to explore it you need something like 6 HMs. Look, I understand these early Pokemon games are going to require some HMs. I'm not surprised I need Surf, not surprised I need any of the water HMs because it is a water-based region, but it gets to a point where you wonder if the devs even considered how many you'd end up needing, especially since you can't get rid of them without doing a specific thing in the game. It's funny playing the modern games now where all of that is just built in. Flying is part of the Rotom phone, surfing barely even happens anymore. I don't want to be clear, this is very nitpicky because I think Gen 3 is one of the best generations. Emerald specifically is one of the best Pokemon games in my opinion, but it's annoying when you have such a great team in Pokemon Emerald and it just has to carry this extra weight of mediocre moves. Because I guess Surf and Waterfall are fine, but I don't want to use Dive, Rock Smash, Cut, or Flash. 5 HMs are mandatory just to finish the story, and if you actually want to see the whole region, that number climbs even higher. So I don't have much to say about FireRed and LeafGreen, not because they're bad, far from it, these are actually some of my favorite Pokemon games, but I think they're just largely safe remakes. These games didn't do anything to harm the original, like these are much better than the original games, and I'd say by far this is the optimal way to play Gen 1. But honestly, I think there's a bigger issue with these games. They just didn't do enough. It's the genuine experience, sure, but I think more could have been added. But that's not actually the worst problem though, because what they did add was a pretty decent postgame with the Sevi Islands. The real issue is how committed the game is to preserving the original Kanto Pokédex. Even when it actively works against you, you can't evolve Golbat into Crobat during the main journey because Crobat wasn't part of the original Gen 1 Pokédex. The game just blocks the evolution outright until you've unlocked the National Dex. There's barely anything wrong with the actual journey here, the problem's entirely in what the game refuses to let you have while you're still on it. Again, this is a nitpicky point and probably one of the shorter discussions I'll have in this list, but even though I think this game is amazing, I do think it could have been better. So for Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, these games are often remembered for their extremely cool Pokemon. I mean, who doesn't love Lucario, Empoleon, Infernape, and the legendaries are also great. Arceus, Dialga, Palkia, Darkrai. But you know what Diamond and Pearl specifically aren't remembered for? How fast they ran. These games had some of the worst optimization I've ever seen, which is impressive because the DS is not a console you think of being hard to optimize for. Like, I understand Scarlet and Violet not running well, like the game is huge, whatever, but DS games are like a few megabytes, bro. Why does it take so long to get in and out of battles with wild Pokemon? And in some parts of the game, you really feel this churning. Routes with snow feel like you're actually stuck in a snowstorm, which, hey, might be good for immersion, but when you're there for so long, encountering wild Pokemon over and over again, and half the time is spent loading while you watch health bars slowly deplete, it just really brings these games down for me. And that's part of the reason it's so hard for me to go back to Diamond and Pearl specifically. Alright, so this is about to get controversial if it hasn't been already. I know HeartGold and SoulSilver are cult classics, like probably my second favorite Pokemon games. People will defend these games with their lives, and honestly, I actually used to be even higher on these games somehow, but I did replay them again recently and I started to notice some of the issues. Of course, we have to acknowledge that the level curve problem from Gen 2 is back, and it's not really any better. It's the same situation where you end up grinding on the Elite Four just to beat the Elite Four, become the champion, and move on to Kanto. So I don't want to harp too much on the issues that already existed in Gen 2, but what is worth talking about is how disappointing the team building still is. They repeated the same mistake from FireRed and LeafGreen by locking a huge number of Pokemon behind the postgame in Kanto. This isn't even the first time Kanto's shown up on this list either. We already talked about FireRed and LeafGreen doing this exact thing, and here it is again, causing problems in a completely different game in a completely different generation. Also, spoiler alert, it's not the last time either. So once again, we're dealing with problems that have already shown up in previous games, and now they're stacking on top of each other. But the real issue I think HeartGold and SoulSilver have is Kanto itself. And yeah, I know someone's gonna say Kanto's technically part of the main story, not a post-game in the traditional sense, and that's fair. Doesn't make the wild Pokemon there any less asleep. Kanto feels like there was a national tragedy the day before you arrived, because the vibe is just sometimes so ominous and lifeless. Compared to the culture and beauty of Johto, Kanto feels corporate and empty. Now, I don't know if this was intentional, because Johto is based on the Kansai region of Japan, which is more historical and cultural, while Kanto is based on the Tokyo area. And honestly, now that I'm saying it out loud, that might actually be the point, but from a gameplay perspective, it's not the best thing either. You're going through the motions, sure you're beating gym leaders, but does it really matter? It doesn't always feel like you're building towards anything meaningful. You're just going to fight the same Elite Four you already beat, but even though this game has a lot of issues, I still think it's just a fantastic and beautiful game that it really starts to overshadow a lot of those. So on to Gen 5, I actually grew up with Black and White as an early 2000s kid, so maybe there's some bias here. The two things I keep coming back to here are the linearity and the Pokemon design. On the linearity front, Black and White took a much more story-focused approach, and a story-focused RPG is bound to be more linear. That's part of why I'm fine with it being such a straight run to the end. It doesn't feel that way while you're actually in the game, and as for the Pokemon design, I think it got a little overhated if I'm being honest. When this game came out, everyone was clowning on the ice cream Pokemon and the trash bag Pokemon, but Pokemon has always had simple designs like that. Gen 1 fans clowning on the ice cream Pokemon is one of the funniest things to happen in this fanbase, considering what a Rattata is. I'm kidding. Mostly. Objectively speaking, I'd agree Gen 5 doesn't have the same heavy-hitting designs as something like Diamond and Pearl, but past that, I don't have much negative to say about Black and White, and this is easily one of my favorite entries in the series. And if Black and White is near perfect, Black and White 2 might be even closer. I had to think about this one for a while to try to find something that actually bothered me during my playthrough, and the closest thing I landed on is that the story takes a step back from the original. It's a little less driven than Black and White's whole end through line, though there's still a real continuation of the story here, it just doesn't quite hit the same. The bigger issue, if I'm being honest, is how late the Dano line shows up. You can't even catch Dano in the wild because it's breeding only. Zweilous is a rare encounter in Victory Road, right at the tail end of the game, and it doesn't evolve into Hydreigon until level 64. Technically, you could still use it before the credits roll, but almost no one actually will. For a pair of games this close to perfect, that's the one real complaint I can land on. Alright, on to Gen 6, let's talk about the jump to the 3D era. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say the worst part of Gen 6 was the fact that Pokemon became 3D, but I don't really agree with that. While I do think that some of the designs could be better, I don't think that's the core issue. Another thing people always say about X and Y is that they're way too easy, but honestly, I think later games deserve that criticism more. I know someone's typing, it's my first game, it's supposed to be easy. Right now, sure, but that's not even the issue I actually have with it. In my opinion, the biggest problem with Pokemon X and Y is that the game doesn't really have its own identity. A lot of the appeal comes from bringing back older Pokemon. Think about it. You're gifted so many from previous generations. You get a Snorlax, your Lucario, your choice of a Gen 1 starter, and plenty more. And if you ask me what my favorite from Gen 6 is, it's probably an older one that got a Mega Evolution in this game, not even a Pokemon native to Kalos. Now with Legends EA, Kalos and especially Lumio City finally feels like it has a unique identity, but in X and Y, that identity just isn't here. Now I love Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and if you want to see more of my opinions on that, go check out my Pokemon ranking. This is one of the first Pokemon games I really got into, and I have the most hours in it. It greatly improved on the original Gen 3 versions, and in my opinion, is the best remake ever in the series. However, even with all the nostalgia I have for this game, it's far from perfect. The game absolutely drowns you in power. You get a Mega Starter, you get a Pokemon that would have been endgame rewards in earlier generations, you get cosplay Pikachu, which isn't completely broken or anything, but it's still better than a normal Pikachu. You get Mega Latios or Latios handed to you halfway through the story like it's nothing. And on top of that, the box legendaries don't just show up. They appear as Primal Groudon or Primal Kyogre and some of the most absurdly overpowered Pokemon the series has ever seen. The problem isn't that these things exist, it's the overall balancing. These games are very easy for almost its entire runtime because of this. By the mid-game, it feels like a coughing baby versus Atomic Nuke when you walk into a gym. Matchups barely matter because you're so far ahead of the difficulty curve. This was, like I said, one of the first Pokemon games I really got into, and I wasn't exactly a Pokemon master, but even I barely struggled with it. Well, at least for most of the game. Right at the end, you suddenly hit difficulty spikes. Steven and the Elite Four actually provide a solid challenge, but by that point, it just feels too late. I still really enjoy the game. I love Hoenn, the soundtrack, the 3DS visuals, which somehow have more personality than some Switch era Pokemon visuals, believe it or not. And the Delta episode was genuinely cool. This was one of the games that made me appreciate the Pokemon series in the first place. It just doesn't feel like you earn a lot of your power, and the game really could have used a difficulty bump or slower pacing with the Pokemon it gives you to smooth things out. Sun and Moon are games I originally didn't like, but going back to them, I actually think they're pretty good games. I do have a couple of criticisms though, but the biggest is just how much hand-holding there is, especially early on. There's a related complaint about the sheer number of cutscenes, which is fair, though I don't mind cutscenes in games generally. The real issue is how strung along I felt through the first 2 to 4 hours, specifically the stretch until you reach Howley City. It just feels very orchestrated, and I don't love it. So Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon are basically the same game as Sun and Moon, with new Ultra Beast and some difficulty changes, but there's one change that actually made the experience worse. They changed Lusamine and Lily's story, and it's objectively less developed. Spoiler alert if you haven't played these games. Lily and Lusamine had a very connected storyline, and Lusamine in particular had a genuinely touching moment at the end of her arc with Lily in the original games. And Ultra Sun and Moon, that moment is just completely gone. It's not even alluded to, which is just a shame, because that scene in Ultra Wormhole meant a lot to me, and it's just missing here. For Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, I don't have much to say about these games. They're small releases that tend to fly under the radar, and I think it's an alright remake of Gen 1 and a unique take on Kanto. The biggest flaw is that it's just a bit too easy, and I know that's kind of the point, and I'm not usually one who needs a Pokemon game to be that difficult, but even accounting for all that, it just felt too easy. And another thing is that these games really just didn't need to happen. I have them ranked very low on my ranking, not because the quality of the games is just that bad, but because it kind of just felt pointless. Like, the definitive ways to play Kanto came out generations ago before this. For Sword and Shield, I had to think about this one. I think in a way they kind of started the downfall of Pokemon, but I'm also not saying that these are bad games. In fact, I think these are pretty solid mid-tier Pokemon games. But what I mean by that is that this is where Game Freak really started leaning into practices that actively harm both their reputation and the brand itself. There's 3 major things here. Number 1, the national dex being removed, meaning you couldn't even get every Pokemon in the game. Number 2, the performance issues in the wild area. And number 3, the introduction of DLC. The first issue, I think people eventually got past. Like, it sucks. It really does. But I think people were able to move on because how many new Pokemon were added. The second issue also sucks, but I mean, you could at least make the excuse that this was a new console and the wild area was hard to optimize. But what I can't get past is the introduction of DLC. Because with this, it doesn't feel like they're improving the game out of passion. It feels like content was deliberately held back and then sold separately. I don't think I need to explain why DLC is bad for a game like this, but just in case, these are primarily single-player experiences, and most single-player games are supposed to feel like complete packages at launch. Sure, sometimes you get bonus editions or extra content, maybe cosmetics, side side quests, small additions. Maybe there's something that comes out well after the release, but when you're locking real story content and exclusive Pokemon behind a paywall, it just feels awful here. And also a bigger part of the issue is some of the Pokemon locked behind the DLC are completely strong competitively, which is just a whole other issue. The worst part is that Sword and Shield proved paid DLC could work for the series, and then it came back for Scarlet and Violet and Legends EA. Where to even start with these ones? These are some of the worst Pokemon games ever released, and it's honestly not surprising when you remember they were outsourced. Development on these went to Ilka instead of Game Freak, though Junichi Masuda came back to co-direct alongside Ilka's Yuichi Ueda. So, this was Ilka's first time handling a main series Pokemon game at this scale, and there's two major problems here. Number one, the art style is just ugly. It's not charming, it's not cute. Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee were cute games. This just looks bad here. The second issue, and honestly the bigger one for me, is the lack of improvements from Gen 4, and in some cases actual downgrades. When Platinum released, it fixed a ton of issues from Diamond and Pearl. None of those fixes made it into these remakes. These games run better because they're on the Switch, sure, but that's just hardware. And these are specifically remakes of Diamond and Pearl. Sinnoh apparently just isn't allowed to run well no matter what hardware it's on, so why wouldn't you include the improvements Platinum already made? I don't get it. I don't even want to talk about these games anymore. Let's just move on. Pokemon Legends Arceus was Pokemon's real attempt at an open-world style game, and I think they did a pretty good job for a first try. The problem is that open-world games can hurt themselves when they're too open. If you don't have strong structure or linearity, you need a world packed with things to do, and I don't think Legends Arceus had enough meaningful content to support that. It also doesn't help that the game isn't particularly beautiful. Like, it looks acceptable, but it's not an impressive or visually striking open world either. When I first played it, I thought the beginning was slow and boring, and once the game opens up, there definitely is a repetition issue. The research tasks can become repetitive too. You're repeatedly catching, defeating, or observing the same species to fill out their entries, and the expedition structure keeps sending you back between Jubilee Village between trips. I don't know if that's a hot take, but that's just how I feel. So I actually really like this game, and I appreciate it more on a replay. I definitely think this is an acquired taste, and I definitely think there's a lot of flaws here, but I think if you can get past that, it is still a really great experience. You already know the biggest issue with Scarlet and Violet. It was all over the internet on release, and honestly, it really was talked about a lot until the Switch 2 came out, and it's how bad the performance was. NPCs and background objects would sometimes visibly animate at a fraction of their normal rate, and characters and environmental details would pop into existence at close range. Anywhere with a crowd, gyms, towns, festivals, they would tank the frame rate hard. Now, like I said, it is a lot better on Switch 2, but that's years later, and on release, this game just did not run. And it's a shame too, because I think it had potential to be a great game, and while there's of course plenty of other issues here, that initial launch just really soured a lot of people on this game. Last but not least, Pokemon Legends EA. And I know this game gets a lot of hate, but I actually think it's a pretty good game. It's unlike any formula we've seen in any game in this series, and between the character designs and the Pokemon selection, I think ZA's flaw doesn't come from anything genuinely bad. I know people are going to bring up the flat building textures, and fair, because they're not great to look at, but that's not the biggest issue here. The actual problem, and the thing I did notice in my own playthrough, is that it gets pretty formulaic with the Rogue Mega Evolution battles. It's cool that they built real boss fights into a Pokemon game, difficult ones at times, especially since they're all new designs, but running that same gameplay cycle 3 or 4 times starts to wear thin, and it just gets a little too predictable. It's fine in a way because it pushes you towards the side quests, which are pretty fun, but the fact that the mainline game gets repetitive once you're into it is still a real problem. So going through all these games back to back, there's actually a pattern here. The earlier games are broken because Game Freak didn't know any better yet. Gen 1's battle system, Gen 2's level curve, those are mistakes you make when you're figuring out how to build an RPG for the first time, but somewhere around Gen 8, it feels more like decisions they're actively making. Hopefully with the Winds and Waves coming out on Switch 2 next year that we're gonna see them move in the right direction, but we'll have to see. And that is the biggest issue with every Pokemon game. Now, if you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to help me reach 20,000 subs by the end of the year, and also consider checking out some of my other Pokemon videos and join my Discord. Now, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.